Story 1.
I thought the old hotel was just a cheap, quiet place to stay. But when I found the hidden door in the basement, I realized the darkness within this place went far deeper than I could have imagined. The hotel was old, run down, and located on the outskirts of town. It was perfect for someone like me, looking for a cheap, quiet place to stay while I figured things out. I rented a small room on the second floor, and despite the creaky floors and peeling wallpaper, it felt like it would do. There weren't many guests. I rarely saw anyone besides the receptionist, an old man who barely spoke. The building had an eerie atmosphere. Something about it didn't sit right with me. It wasn't the decay or the occasional odd sound. Those could be explained by age and neglect. No, it was something deeper, an unsettling feeling that crept into my mind at night, making the shadows seem darker, the silence heavier. But I brushed it off. After all, I was here for a place to sleep, not to make friends or get spooked by old legends. The basement, however, always piqued my curiosity. Every time I passed the locked door leading down to it, I felt drawn to it. No one seemed to go down there, and the old man at the desk would glare at anyone who asked about it. "Closed for years," he'd mutter, shifting uncomfortably. But my curiosity only grew. One evening, after another day spent wandering through the empty streets of the town, I decided to do something about it. The hotel was quiet as usual, and the old man had retired to his room, leaving the front desk unmanned. I knew it was now or never. I made my way to the basement door, heart pounding, hoping no one would notice. It was locked, as expected, but a quick search through the reception desk drawers revealed a key labeled B. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if I was making a mistake. But curiosity won out, and I turned the key in the lock. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase descending into the darkness. The air was thick, musty, and the faint sound of something alive echoed from below. I grabbed a flashlight from my bag and took a deep breath before stepping down. The basement was even older than I imagined. The walls were damp, and the ceiling dripped with condensation. My flashlight flickered, casting long shadows as I walked deeper into the labyrinth of storage rooms and forgotten corners. Just as I was about to turn back, I noticed a small, almost hidden door at the far end of the room. It looked much newer than everything else down here, like it had been added recently, or carefully preserved. The door wasn't locked, and with a trembling hand, I pushed it open. Behind it was a narrow stone passage, unlike anything I had seen in the rest of the building. The air here was colder, heavier, almost suffocating. My flashlight barely penetrated the thick darkness ahead, but I felt an overwhelming compulsion to continue. As I walked down the corridor, the walls seemed to close in on me, pressing me further into the depths of the building. My footsteps echoed unnaturally, as if the space around me was vast, yet invisible. After what felt like an eternity, I reached the end of the passage and found myself in a large, dimly lit room. The floor was stone, cold and damp beneath my feet, and scattered around were strange symbols carved into the walls, their meaning unclear. In the center of the room were several iron doors, each with heavy chains and padlocks. I approached one cautiously, drawn to the faint sounds coming from behind it, whispers, breathing, and something else, something I couldn't quite identify. It sounded like the low, guttural growl of an animal, but there was something disturbingly human about it. I knew I shouldn't open it, but my hand moved on its own, reaching for the lock. The lock was rusted, but with a bit of force, it snapped open. As the chains fell away, the door creaked ajar, and I immediately regretted my decision. Inside the small chamber was something I could only describe as twisted. A creature, hunched and malformed, crouched in the corner. Its skin was pale and slick, its limbs long and crooked, and its face, if you could call it that, was a horrifying blend of human and animal features. It stared at me with eyes that seemed to bore into my soul, filled with an insatiable hunger. But it didn't attack. Instead, It breathed in deeply, as if savoring the very air I exhaled. The fear that surged through me seemed to excite it. I took a step back, and the creature moved closer, but slowly, deliberately, feeding off the terror I radiated. Panicking, I slammed the door shut and fumbled with the lock, my hands shaking uncontrollably. The creature's guttural growl grew louder, reverberating through the walls as if it were communicating with others. I could hear movement from behind the other doors now, scratching, shuffling, and the unmistakable sound of chains rattling. Whatever was down here wasn't alone. I needed to leave, but the passage back seemed longer than I remembered. The air had grown colder, and my legs felt heavy as if the very floor was trying to pull me down. Every shadow danced with sinister intent, and the sounds of the creatures grew louder, more frantic, as if they could smell my fear. I hurried through the stone corridor, my heart racing, every instinct screaming at me to escape. The flashlight flickered, and for a brief, terrifying moment, I was plunged into darkness. When the light returned, I could see movement in the periphery of my vision, figures crawling along the walls, lurking just out of sight. The creatures were watching me, waiting for the moment I would falter. Reaching the main basement room felt like a small victory, but I wasn't safe yet. As I reached the staircase leading back up, I heard a noise that froze me in my tracks. The door at the top of the stairs was closing, the unmistakable sound of it being locked echoed down to me. I ran up the stairs, slamming into the door, but it wouldn't budge. Someone, or something, had locked me in. Panic surged through me, but I forced myself to stay calm. There had to be another way out. I turned, only to see that the creatures from the chambers had begun emerging. They moved slowly at first, creeping forward, but their pace quickened the more fear consumed me. I backed away, realizing that my terror was feeding them, giving them strength. I searched the basement frantically, hoping for another exit, but there was none. The creatures closed in, their grotesque forms moving in ways no living being should. Their mouths opened, and I heard something I never expected: laughter. It wasn't joyous, it was mocking, twisted, and full of malice. They thrived on my fear, growing bolder with each passing second. One of the creatures lunged, and I barely managed to avoid its grasp. Its claws scraped the stone floor, leaving deep gouges where I had been standing just moments before. The room felt alive with their presence, the very walls vibrating with their hunger. I stumbled backward, desperate to keep some distance between us, but they were relentless. In my frenzy, I knocked over a stack of old crates, revealing something behind them, a small, hidden door. It was barely large enough for a person to fit through, but it was my only chance. Without thinking, I dove for it, prying it open with all the strength I had left. The creatures screeched in frustration as I crawled through the narrow opening, feeling the cold stone scrape against my skin. The passage was tight, claustrophobic, but it was better than facing the horrors behind me. I crawled for what felt like hours, my breath shallow and my body aching. The air in the tunnel was stale, and every sound seemed amplified in the confined space. I could still hear the creatures in the basement, their frustrated growls and laughter echoing faintly behind me. Eventually, the passage opened up into a larger space, though it was still far from comfortable. I found myself in a hidden chamber, much older than the rest of the hotel. Ancient, crumbling stone walls surrounded me, and the air felt thick with the weight of forgotten history. In the center of the room was a strange altar, covered in dust and cobwebs, surrounded by symbols similar to the ones I'd seen in the basement. I didn't understand what I was looking at, but I knew it wasn't good. The altar seemed to pulse with a dark energy, and the very air around it felt wrong. I approached cautiously, unable to shake the feeling that I was walking into something far worse than what I had already encountered. Before I could react, the ground beneath me shifted. The stones trembled, and a low, guttural sound filled the chamber. It wasn't coming from the creatures behind me, it was coming from beneath the altar. I stepped back, eyes wide as the sound grew louder, more menacing. The altar began to crack, revealing something underneath, something alive. The symbols on the walls began to glow faintly, casting an eerie light over the chamber. I realized with horror that this wasn't just a hiding place for those creatures. This was a prison for something far older, far more dangerous. The ground split open, and from beneath the altar, a massive, grotesque hand emerged, its skin pale and slick like the creatures, but far larger, far more ancient. The air around it warped, and I could feel my fear intensifying, threatening to overwhelm me. Whatever was down here had been trapped for centuries, and now I had unwittingly set it free. I turned to flee, but the passage I had crawled through had collapsed. There was no way back. I was trapped in the chamber with this thing, and I could feel it feeding on my fear, growing stronger with every second. The creatures from the basement had been bad enough, but this was something far worse. As the hand continued to rise, I saw more of the creature's body emerging. It was massive, filling the chamber with its presence, its dark, empty eyes locked onto me. There was no escape, no hope of survival. The hotel had been built over this prison, and now I understood why the basement had been sealed off for so long. My mind raced, desperately searching for a way out, but I knew there was none. The creature's presence was overwhelming, and the air grew colder, thicker with every breath I took. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my thoughts becoming frantic. This wasn't just a creature, it was fear incarnate, a being that thrived on the terror of others. I could hear the creatures from the basement now, clawing their way toward the chamber. They were drawn to the power of this ancient entity, feeding off the same fear that was now consuming me. I backed away from the altar, but there was nowhere to go. The walls seemed to close in around me, trapping me in this nightmare. As the creature's body continued to rise from the ground, its gaze never left mine. I realized then that I wasn't just a victim, I was the final piece in some dark, twisted ritual. My fear was the key to its freedom, and I had walked right into the trap. The hotel, the creatures, the hidden passage, they were all part of this ancient design. I felt a sharp pain in my chest as the weight of the terror crushed me. The walls of the chamber seemed to pulse with dark energy, and the creature's laughter echoed all around me. This was it. There was no escape. The last thing I saw before everything went black was the creature fully emerging from beneath the altar, its massive form towering over me, its eyes filled with a dark hunger. I could feel my mind slipping away, consumed by the overwhelming fear that had taken hold of me. The hotel, the basement, the creatures, they had all been feeding me to this thing, preparing me for this moment. And then, silence. Cold, suffocating silence. I never left that hotel. The world outside went on, unaware of the ancient horror that lurked beneath the building, feeding on the terror of those foolish enough to enter. The old man at the desk, the other guests, they were all part of it, keeping the secret safe, ensuring that the fear would never stop. If you ever find yourself in a rundown hotel on the outskirts of a forgotten town, and you feel the pull of a locked door, resist the urge to explore. Some doors are meant to stay closed, and some fears are too powerful to face alone. Because once you open that door, there's no turning back.
Story 2.
The first time I heard the whispers, I thought it was just the house settling. But when I saw something move in the basement, I knew this house wasn't just old, it was alive with something I couldn't explain. The first time I heard the whispers, I thought it was just the house settling. But when I saw something move in the basement, I knew this house wasn't just old, it was alive with something I couldn't explain. I've always prided myself on being a rational person, but nothing could have prepared me for the terror that awaited me in the basement of my new home. It began with whispers, soft, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to rise from the depths of the house late at night. At first, I convinced myself it was just the old pipes or the creaking wood, but as the nights wore on, the whispers became clearer, more distinct. Curiosity got the better of me one night, and I decided to investigate. Armed with a flashlight, I descended the creaky wooden stairs leading to the basement. The air grew colder the deeper I went, and the sound of my footsteps echoed in the confined space. At the bottom of the stairs, I scanned the room with my flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing boxes, old furniture, and the remnants of the previous owners' lives, but nothing out of the ordinary. Yet the whispers continued. That's when I saw it, something moving in the corner, just out of the light. I froze, straining my eyes to see more clearly, but the figure vanished as quickly as it had appeared. My heart pounded in my chest, but I told myself it was just a trick of the light. Little did I know, it was only the beginning. For the next few nights, I tried to ignore the whispers, but they seemed to grow louder, as if calling to me. They weren't just random sounds anymore, they felt intentional. The words were still unclear, but I could feel their weight, like an invisible presence that filled the air around me. Sleep became impossible. Every creak in the house sent a chill down my spine. I could feel something watching me, lurking just out of sight, waiting for the perfect moment. One evening, I decided to block out the sound. I put on music, turned the volume up as high as I could tolerate, and sat in my living room, trying to drown out the oppressive atmosphere. For a while, it worked. The whispers faded, replaced by the comforting noise of familiar tunes. But then, in the middle of a song, the music cut off abruptly, leaving nothing but silence. And in that silence, the whispers returned, louder than ever. This time, they were not just voices. I heard footsteps. Gripped by fear, I sat frozen in my chair, unable to move. My eyes darted to the hallway that led to the basement door. The footsteps grew closer, echoing through the house. My breath quickened, my pulse raced, but I couldn't force myself to get up. The handle of the basement door slowly turned, as if someone, or something, was trying to open it. But no one was there. The next day, I considered leaving. Packing my bags and never coming back to this cursed place seemed like the only option. But I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was happening, it wouldn't let me go so easily. I needed to know what was in that basement. I had to confront it, whatever it was, before it consumed me entirely. I spent hours during the day researching the house's history. I discovered that it had changed hands many times over the decades, but each owner stayed only briefly. The details were vague, but there were mentions of disappearances, strange occurrences, and unexplained deaths. One article mentioned that the house had once been the site of an unsolved murder. The victim's body was found in the basement, strangled, but with no signs of a struggle. That night, I made my decision. Armed with nothing but a flashlight and my determination, I descended into the basement once again. This time, the whispers seemed eager, excited even, as if they knew I was coming. The air was colder than before, thick with a sense of dread. The darkness pressed in around me, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. My heart pounded in my ears as I swept the flashlight across the room. Then I saw it. A figure, hunched over in the far corner, its movements slow and deliberate. My flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows across the walls. The figure moved closer. I wanted to run, to get out of that basement as fast as I could, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. It was as if the very air around me held me in place, trapping me in that suffocating darkness. The figure stepped into the light. I expected a face, a human face, but what I saw was something beyond comprehension. Its features were distorted, shifting, like a reflection in water. Eyes that weren't eyes. A mouth that wasn't a mouth. The longer I stared, the more it seemed to unravel, as though reality itself was bending around this creature. The whispers grew louder now, forming words that were just on the edge of understanding. "Join us," they seemed to say. "We are waiting." I backed away, but the figure mirrored my movements, coming closer with each step. My flashlight sputtered, threatening to die, but I kept it trained on the thing in front of me, desperate to keep it at bay. Then, in an instant, the figure lunged at me. I stumbled backward, tripping over a pile of old furniture, and landed hard on the cold, damp floor. The flashlight slipped from my hand, and in that brief moment of darkness, I felt it, something cold and unnatural, brush against my skin. I scrambled to my feet, grabbed the flashlight, and bolted up the stairs, slamming the basement door shut behind me. I locked it, but I knew it wouldn't keep whatever was down there from getting out. The whispers were still there, muffled now, but persistent. My whole body was trembling, my mind racing. What had I just seen? Was it real, or was I losing my grip on reality? The next few days passed in a blur. I avoided the basement at all costs, but the feeling of being watched never left me. Every creak in the floorboards, every shadow in the corner of my eye made my skin crawl. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. The house felt like a prison, and I was trapped inside it with something I couldn't understand. One night, as I lay awake in bed, I heard it again, footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from the hallway outside my bedroom. My heart stopped. I knew the basement door was locked. There was no way anything could have gotten out. But the footsteps were real. I could hear them getting closer, closer, until they stopped right outside my door. I held my breath, waiting for the handle to turn. But it didn't. Instead, I heard a soft knock, 3 slow, deliberate taps. The sound of the basement door opening sent a shiver down my spine. I stood there, rooted to the spot, my breath shallow and ragged. The door hadn't just opened on its own. Something had opened it. The whispers returned, more insistent this time, echoing up from the darkness below. "Come back. We're waiting." I knew I couldn't just stand there, but the thought of going back into that basement filled me with a dread I had never known before. My heart told me to run, to leave the house and never look back, but my feet carried me toward the basement instead. I walked down the stairs, each step heavier than the last, as if the house itself was trying to pull me into the abyss. The basement door was wide open, revealing the gaping blackness below. My flashlight flickered weakly in my hand, barely piercing the darkness. I stepped onto the first stair, and as soon as I did, the whispers grew louder, swirling around me like a suffocating fog. "Closer. Come closer." I descended slowly, gripping the banister tightly, my legs trembling with every step. The basement seemed different this time, more oppressive, as if the walls themselves were closing in on me. My flashlight beam wavered, casting erratic shadows across the floor, and in the corner of my eye, I thought I saw movement, something slithering just out of sight. When I reached the bottom, the whispers stopped abruptly, leaving an eerie silence in their wake. I swept the flashlight across the room, and that's when I saw it, the door, hidden in the far wall, barely visible behind a stack of old, rotting furniture. The door was slightly ajar, and from behind it came a faint glow, a sickly, unnatural light. I approached it cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. As I pushed the door open, the stench hit me first, decay, rot, and something else, something I couldn't place. Inside was a small room, and in the center of that room was a table. On the table, covered in dust and cobwebs, was an old, leather-bound book. The book seemed ancient, its cover worn and cracked, but there was something about it that drew me in. My hands shook as I reached for it, every instinct in my body screaming at me to stop, to turn back. But I couldn't. I had to know. I had to understand what was happening in this house, what had been calling to me from the moment I first set foot in the basement. I opened the book, and the moment I did, the whispers returned, louder, more frantic. The pages were filled with strange symbols and drawings that made my skin crawl. I couldn't read the text, but as I flipped through the pages, I realized something horrifying. The drawings were of me. Each page depicted a different moment since I had moved into the house, me unpacking, me sleeping, me standing at the top of the basement stairs. The last image was of me in that very moment, holding the book, with a shadowy figure standing behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing there, only the oppressive darkness and the faint, unnatural glow from the room. A sudden gust of wind whipped through the basement, and the door slammed shut behind me, trapping me inside. Panic surged through me, and I bolted for the door, trying to force it open, but it wouldn't budge. The whispers were deafening now, a cacophony of voices screaming in my ears. "It's too late. You're one of us." I pounded on the door, screaming for help, but no one could hear me. The walls seemed to close in around me, the darkness swallowing me whole. My flashlight flickered and died, leaving me in total blackness. And then, in the distance, I heard it, the slow, deliberate footsteps of something coming closer. I turned toward the sound, heart hammering in my chest. My mind raced, searching for a way out, but deep down I knew there was none. The footsteps stopped, and I felt the presence behind me, cold, oppressive, and hungry. The last thing I heard before everything went black was the sound of the basement door unlocking.
Story 3.
The floor beneath my feet collapsed, revealing not just an empty void, but the entrance to something far older and darker than I ever imagined. What I found lurking below has been waiting for centuries, and now it's awake. I never thought my house would be the place where I'd uncover something ancient, something monstrous. It all started with a single moment, a crack in the floorboards beneath my feet, followed by the sudden collapse that revealed an ominous, dark void below. At first, I thought it was just a sinkhole or a long-forgotten cellar. But as I peered deeper, I realized this wasn't just any ordinary discovery. There was a tunnel, hidden beneath my home, stretching far into the earth. The air down there was cold, unnaturally so, as if it hadn't been touched by warmth in centuries. With my heart racing and flashlight in hand, I descended, compelled by a sense of dread and curiosity I couldn't resist. As I ventured deeper, the tunnel opened up into a massive underground city. The structures were ancient, crumbling, yet eerily well preserved. Shadows flickered in the corners of my vision, and I began to feel like I was being watched. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the faint sound of whispers echoing off the stone walls. I soon realized that I wasn't alone. Movement in the darkness caught my eye, quick and deliberate, as though the shadows themselves were alive. These creatures, whatever they were, skulked at the edges of my vision, never fully revealing themselves. But I could feel their presence, like 1,000 unseen eyes tracking my every step. The deeper I went, the more unsettling the city became. Symbols, ancient and unreadable, were carved into the walls of every building, and there were no signs of life, no food, no warmth, nothing that would suggest this place had been inhabited by humans. And yet, something lived here. I stumbled upon what seemed to be a central square. In the middle stood a statue, grotesque and twisted, depicting a creature that defied explanation, its form both human and beast, its face an expression of eternal torment. I couldn't shake the feeling that this was a warning, a message left by those who came before. That night, I made the mistake of staying too long. The sun had set above ground, and as darkness crept over the surface, the city beneath came alive. From the tunnel entrance, I heard the sound of something scraping against stone, followed by low, guttural growls. I bolted back toward the exit, but the creatures were faster. They emerged from the shadows, skeletal, elongated figures with skin stretched tight over their bones, their eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. I barely made it out, slamming the door to the tunnel shut behind me. My heart raced, and I could still hear their hisses from below, echoing through the floorboards of my house. It was only after escaping that I realized the truth. These creatures weren't confined to the underground. They only hid from the light, biding their time until nightfall. Now, as the sun sets each evening, I hear them scratching at the walls, growing bolder with every passing night. I thought locking the tunnel door would keep them at bay, but I was wrong. Every night, the noises grow louder. At first, it was just the scratching, subtle, almost like rats scurrying inside the walls. But now, I hear their footsteps, slow, deliberate, and heavy. They've become braver, closer. Last night, I woke up drenched in sweat. The door to the basement was ajar. I know I locked it before bed. I checked again and again, but there it was, wide open, leading down to the darkness below. I didn't dare go near it. I simply stared, heart pounding, waiting to hear the familiar sounds of scraping stone. Instead, I heard something worse, whispers. They weren't just in my head anymore. They filled the house, echoing from the basement, soft but unmistakable. They spoke in a language I couldn't understand, but I knew, somehow, that they were talking about me. The realization hit me, they're coming. They're waiting for the right moment. The following day, I made the decision to leave. I packed my things in a hurry, desperate to get as far away as possible. But as I prepared to leave, the sunlight began to fade. I could feel it, the creatures stirring beneath the floor, waking as night approached. I hadn't left in time. I stood frozen in my living room, keys in hand, listening. The whispers began again, growing louder, more urgent. My head spun with terror. I ran for the front door, but before I could open it, I felt a chill race down my spine. Something was behind me. I didn't have to look to know they were there, watching, waiting. Summoning every ounce of courage, I swung the door open and bolted outside. The cool night air hit my face as I ran, not stopping until I reached the edge of town. But even then, I knew I wasn't safe. I could still feel their presence, lingering, as though they were following me from beneath the ground. I drove for hours, far away from that cursed house. I reached a small motel on the outskirts of the next town, exhausted and shaken. The receptionist gave me a key, eyeing me with suspicion as I stumbled toward my room. I locked the door behind me and collapsed onto the bed, hoping for some kind of peace. But sleep didn't come. The whispers followed me, even here. Faint at first, then louder, filling the room with the same indecipherable language that haunted my nights. I shot up in bed, heart pounding. The whispers were clearer now, as if they were just outside the door. Trembling, I crept toward the window and peeked outside. At first, all seemed normal. But then I saw them, those glowing eyes, just beyond the tree line. They had followed me. The creatures had left the tunnel and were now roaming the surface, hunting me. Morning came, but it brought no relief. The creatures may hide from the light, but they're always there, just beneath the surface, waiting for nightfall. I couldn't stay in one place too long. I packed up and drove further away, thinking maybe distance would keep me safe. But wherever I went, they followed. I started to notice things, small, almost imperceptible signs that they were close. A flicker of movement in the corner of my eye, shadows shifting in ways they shouldn't. And always, the whispers. Even in the middle of the day, they crept into my thoughts, a constant reminder that they were near. I reached out to people, friends, family, but no one believed me. They thought I was losing my mind, that the isolation had gotten to me. But I knew better. These creatures were real, and they weren't just after me. They were after anyone who got too close to their secret. I finally realized there was no escaping them. No matter how far I ran, they would always find me. The only thing left to do was confront them. I returned to the house, to the tunnel beneath the floor. This time, I wouldn't be a victim. I had to face whatever was down there and put an end to it. The house was quiet when I arrived, but the air was thick with an oppressive weight. The whispers began almost immediately, louder than ever. I made my way down to the basement, flashlight in hand, my breath catching in my throat with every step. The door to the tunnel stood ajar, waiting for me. With shaking hands, I pushed the door open and descended into the darkness once again. The creatures didn't hide this time. As I reached the underground city, they emerged, slowly, deliberately, their glowing eyes fixed on me. There were more of them than I had ever imagined, hundreds, maybe thousands, lurking in the shadows. I stood frozen in the center of the ancient square, surrounded by those hideous creatures. Their faces were twisted into expressions of hunger, their bodies contorted in unnatural shapes. I could feel their malice, their desire to consume me, to drag me into their world of darkness and fear. But I wasn't going to let that happen. Not without a fight. I reached into my bag and pulled out a small vial of gasoline and a lighter. I had come prepared. If I couldn't defeat them, I would destroy their home. I doused the ground around me, soaking the crumbling stones in fuel. The creatures hesitated, their glowing eyes narrowing as they realized what I was about to do. I flicked the lighter and tossed it into the center of the square. Flames erupted, spreading quickly across the ancient city. The creatures screeched, their cries echoing through the tunnels as the fire consumed everything in its path. I barely made it out alive. The flames chased me up the tunnel, the heat singeing my skin as I scrambled toward the surface. I slammed the door shut behind me, gasping for air, as the fire roared below. I had done it. I had destroyed their home, sealed them underground for good. Or so I thought. It's been days since I escaped the fire, but I can't shake the feeling that they're still out there, lurking, waiting for their chance to return. Every night, I hear the whispers again, faint but unmistakable. I see their eyes in the shadows, just beyond the reach of the light. I know now that I can never truly escape them. They're always there, beneath the surface, waiting for the night to fall. Waiting for the darkness to come again.
Story 4.
It was the first time in years that I'd forgotten to lock the basement door. A seemingly trivial mistake that no one else would think twice about, yet it marked the beginning of an inexplicable nightmare. I had always known our library was old, but I never paid much attention to the basement, a vast, neglected space where the only company was dust and silence. The basement had a reputation for being eerie. Most staff avoided it entirely, convinced that the only thing down there were old records and forgotten memories. I often wondered about the strange whispers that seemed to seep through the cracks of the basement door, but I never had the courage to investigate. Until that day. That night, as I worked late to finish some paperwork, I noticed a peculiar chill. The temperature dropped noticeably, even though the heating was running fine. I dismissed it as a draft and continued working, unaware that my oversight had opened a gateway to something far more sinister. I was about to leave when I saw something out of the corner of my eye, a fleeting shadow darting across the hallway leading to the basement. My heart raced as I froze, straining to listen. The once faint whispers had become distinct murmurs, as if voices were rising from the darkness below, calling to me. Curiosity got the better of me. I approached the basement door, which I had left ajar in my haste. The dim light from the hall barely penetrated the deep shadows inside. As I peered into the abyss, the darkness seemed to writhe and pulse as if alive. It was then that I realized I wasn't alone. A shiver ran down my spine as I noticed the shadows beginning to move. They weren't just dark patches, they seemed to have form and intent. They whispered in a language I couldn't understand, and their presence felt oddly familiar, like a forgotten memory trying to resurface. I tried to shut the door, but it felt as though something was holding it open from the other side. Panic surged through me as I struggled with the heavy door, the whispers growing louder, more insistent. It was as if the basement was alive, eager to drag me into its depths. Finally managing to close the door, I staggered back, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. I glanced around, half expecting to see someone standing behind me. But the hallway was empty, save for the lingering, oppressive silence. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me out of the basement. Sleep was elusive that night. Every creak and groan of the old building seemed magnified, and I could swear I heard faint whispers in my dreams. When morning came, I resolved to investigate the basement properly. Though dread gnawed at my resolve, the following day, I ventured into the basement with a flashlight and a sense of unease. The darkness seemed thicker down there, the air colder and heavier. The dusty shelves were lined with old, forgotten books, their spines cracked and faded. The sense of history was palpable, and I felt a strange compulsion to explore further. I discovered an old journal hidden behind a stack of books. Its pages were filled with cryptic symbols and writings that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. As I skimmed through the entries, I realized they spoke of entities bound by forbidden knowledge, feeding off the energy of those who dared to read their secrets. An overwhelming sense of dread gripped me as I understood the true nature of the basement's inhabitants. They were not just shadows, they were entities feeding on the energy of those who read the books they guarded. The whispers I had heard were their call for sustenance, a lure to draw me into their grasp. The more I delved into the journal, the more I could feel the basement's oppressive presence. The shadows seemed to gather closer, their forms becoming more defined as if drawn by my growing fear. The basement was no longer just a dark space, it was a living entity, hungry and malevolent. I tried to leave, but the basement seemed to resist my departure. The air grew heavier, and the temperature plummeted even further. The whispers turned into a cacophony of voices, each one more desperate and menacing than the last. It felt as though the walls themselves were closing in on me, urging me to stay and join their ranks. Desperation clawed at me as I stumbled back towards the stairs. I knew I had to get out, but the basement seemed determined to keep me there. The shadows twisted and writhed, reaching out as if to pull me back into their dark embrace. My heart pounded as I finally made it to the top of the stairs, slamming the door shut behind me. Days passed, and I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination running wild. But the basement's grip on my mind never loosened. I could still hear the whispers in my dreams, feel the shadows watching me from the corners of my vision. The oppressive presence of the basement had followed me, seeping into my daily life. I decided to confide in a colleague, hoping to share the burden and perhaps find some solace. But when I described my experiences, I saw only skepticism in their eyes. They dismissed my fears as stress and fatigue, advising me to take some time off to clear my head. Reluctantly, I took their advice but found no relief. The shadows seemed to follow me even when I was away from the library. I began to question my own sanity, wondering if I had been affected by the basement's darkness more than I had realized. Determined to understand what was happening, I returned to the basement once more, armed with a tape recorder and a camera. I hoped to capture evidence of the shadows and the whispers, something tangible that could confirm my fears. The basement was as foreboding as ever, and the shadows seemed to loom even larger than before. As I set up my equipment, the whispers began anew, a chorus of malevolent voices that seemed to echo through the cold, dark air. The shadows coalesced into forms that danced just out of the reach of my camera's lens, always moving, always watching. Suddenly, the air grew colder, and the whispers became a deafening roar. I felt a sharp, icy pressure against my chest, as though the shadows were trying to push me back. Panic surged through me, but I forced myself to stay, knowing that leaving now might mean never returning to find out the truth. My attempts to document the basement's phenomena yielded little, as the recordings and photographs were filled with static and dark, blurry shapes. It was as if the shadows were deliberately obstructing any evidence of their existence. Each night, as I reviewed the footage, I felt a growing sense of dread. I began to notice subtle changes in myself. I was growing more withdrawn, my sleep plagued by nightmares of the basement and its insidious inhabitants. The whispers seemed to follow me wherever I went, a constant reminder of the darkness I had unwittingly unleashed. One night, as I lay in bed, I heard a distinct scratching sound coming from the basement door. It was a rhythmic, deliberate noise, as though something was trying to get through. My heart raced as I realized that whatever was in the basement was now trying to reach me directly. I knew I had to act before the basement's influence consumed me entirely. I researched the library's history, hoping to find any clue that might explain the presence of the shadows and how to banish them. I discovered that the library had been built over the site of an old occult ritual, and the basement was the focal point of the dark energy. The more I learned, the more I realized how deep the library's dark legacy ran. The shadows, it seemed, were remnants of an ancient curse, feeding on the fear and energy of those who came into contact with their forbidden knowledge. They had been bound to the basement, but my carelessness had loosened their chains. Determined to end the nightmare, I prepared a ritual to close the gateway between the basement and the world above. Armed with the knowledge I had gathered, I descended into the basement one last time, ready to confront the shadows and put an end to their reign of terror. The basement was darker than ever, the shadows almost palpable. As I began the ritual, the whispers turned into a cacophony of angry voices, each one pleading and threatening in equal measure. The temperature dropped to an unbearable chill, and the darkness seemed to close in around me. I performed the ritual as best as I could, but the shadows were relentless. They twisted and contorted, fighting against the forces I was trying to summon. The air was thick with malevolence, and the basement seemed to resist every attempt to drive the darkness away. In the end, the shadows proved too strong. As the ritual reached its climax, the darkness surged forward, engulfing me in its cold embrace. I felt myself being pulled into the void, the whispers becoming a deafening roar. The last thing I remember was the overwhelming sensation of being consumed by the very darkness I had sought to banish. And then, silence.
Story 5.
When I first laid eyes on the old house, I was enchanted by its quaint charm and low price. The realtor had been quick to assure me it was a great deal, and though the house seemed a bit too quiet, I was eager to make it my own. However, the sense of excitement was soon overshadowed by an unsettling discovery. The previous owners had vanished without a trace. Their disappearance was never explained, and their absence left an eerie emptiness in the house. One evening, as I settled into my new home, I heard faint noises coming from the basement. At first, I dismissed them as the house settling or pipes creaking. But curiosity got the better of me. I descended into the basement, armed with nothing more than a flashlight and a growing sense of unease. The basement was musty and dimly lit, filled with the scent of mildew and old wood. As I made my way down the creaky stairs, the noise seemed to grow louder, echoing off the walls. When I reached the bottom, I spotted something unusual in the corner of the room, a heavy, dust-covered curtain that had been hidden away. Pulling it aside, I was startled to reveal a small, hidden chamber. The chamber was lined with ancient symbols and strange artifacts. My flashlight flickered over an old, dust-covered altar in the center of the room. The altar was intricately carved, its surface covered in faded, ominous runes. Candles, now long burned out, were arranged in a circle around it. The atmosphere was thick with an oppressive darkness that seemed to seep from the walls themselves. I felt a shiver run down my spine as I approached the altar. It seemed as though the very air was holding its breath, waiting for something. The symbols on the altar appeared to be part of some arcane ritual, and a cold, heavy silence hung in the air. As I studied the carvings, an unsettling thought crossed my mind. Was this altar connected to the previous owner's disappearance? The basement seemed to close in around me, the temperature dropping sharply. I turned to leave, but as I did, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. A faint, shimmering outline of a figure appeared in the corner of my eye. It was gone as quickly as it had appeared, but the sensation of being watched was unmistakable. That night, sleep eluded me. The house felt different, almost alive with a malevolent presence. The noise from the basement seemed to have escalated into an unsettling hum that resonated through the walls. I tried to brush it off, but the unsettling feeling remained, gnawing at the edges of my consciousness. As dawn broke, I resolved to investigate further. I returned to the basement, hoping to find some rational explanation for the strange occurrences. The altar was still there, untouched and seemingly waiting for me. I noticed that one of the candles, though long extinguished, had left a peculiar mark on the altar, a dark, almost sticky residue that seemed out of place. With a growing sense of dread, I began to piece together the symbols and runes from the altar. My research led me to ancient texts and folklore, each story more chilling than the last. They spoke of entities bound to dark places, waiting for someone to unwittingly release them. The thought that this might be the fate of the previous owners gnawed at my mind. Days turned into weeks, and the disturbances grew more frequent. Objects in the house would move on their own, and whispers filled the air at night. I tried to ignore them, but the feeling of being watched was ever present. The altar in the basement seemed to call to me, its dark allure impossible to resist. One particularly restless night, I heard a loud crash from the basement. My heart pounded as I made my way downstairs, only to find the altar had been disturbed. The candles were now lit, casting eerie shadows that danced along the walls. A chill ran down my spine as I realized that the runes on the altar seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. I was no longer alone in the house. The whispers had turned into guttural voices that seemed to come from all directions. The walls felt like they were closing in, and a sense of dread weighed heavily on my chest. I knew I had to find out what was behind the altar before it was too late. Determined to uncover the truth, I decided to dig deeper into the history of the house and its previous occupants. I visited the local library and scoured old records, but found nothing significant until I stumbled upon a forgotten journal, hidden away in the archives. The journal belonged to the last owner, and its pages were filled with frantic notes and strange symbols. As I read through the journal, it became clear that the previous owner had been deeply involved in dark rituals. The entries spoke of an entity bound to the house, a creature that thrived on fear and darkness. The rituals were meant to keep it imprisoned, but something had gone wrong, and now the entity was waiting for its next victim. The more I read, the more I realized that the entity had likely been awakened by my arrival. It had been lying dormant, waiting for someone to unlock its prison. I felt a growing sense of panic. The thought that I might be the next victim weighed heavily on my mind. The journal revealed that the entity was known as the Keeper of Shadows, a being bound to the dark corners of the world, waiting to be freed. Its power grew stronger with each passing day, feeding off the fear and despair of those who encountered it. The previous owners had tried to contain it, but their efforts had failed, leading to their mysterious disappearance. The realization hit me hard. I was trapped in a house with an ancient evil, and my only option was to confront it. Armed with the knowledge from the journal, I prepared myself for the confrontation. I gathered the necessary items and headed back to the basement, determined to end the nightmare once and for all. As I descended into the basement, the air felt colder than ever. The altar seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent. The shadows on the walls seemed to move with a life of their own, and I knew I was running out of time. With a trembling hand, I began to perform the counter-ritual described in the journal. The symbols and incantations were complex, and each misstep could spell disaster. The air crackled with energy as I chanted the ancient words, and the shadows around me seemed to writhe in response. The altar's dark aura grew stronger, and I could feel the entity's presence closing in. The whispers turned into a cacophony of voices, each one more desperate and tormenting than the last. The temperature in the basement dropped, and I could see my breath misting in the cold air. As I reached the final words of the ritual, a blinding flash of light erupted from the altar. The shadows recoiled, and the whispers became a deafening roar. I fell to my knees, exhausted and gasping for breath. The light began to fade, and the basement returned to its oppressive darkness. The silence that followed was almost as unsettling as the chaos. The altar was still there, but its dark power seemed to have been quelled. I had managed to banish the entity, at least for now, but I knew that the house was forever tainted by its presence. I spent the following days trying to cleanse the house of any lingering malevolence. I conducted rituals and prayers, hoping to rid the house of any remaining traces of the dark force. The disturbances slowly subsided, but the sense of unease remained. I made the decision to leave the house, knowing that I could never fully escape the darkness that had taken root within its walls. The house was put up for sale, and I hoped that the next owner would never experience the horrors that I had. As I drove away, I glanced back at the house one last time, knowing that its dark secrets would remain hidden, waiting for the next unsuspecting soul. Years passed, and the house remained a distant memory. I moved on with my life, but the experiences I had in that old house never left me. The nightmares and the fear lingered, shaping my perceptions and my understanding of the unknown. I often wondered if the house had claimed more victims since I left. The local legend of the vanished owners grew with each passing year, and the stories of the house's dark history spread. I hoped that my actions had made a difference, but I knew that some darkness was impossible to completely eradicate. The journal I found remained in my possession, a constant reminder of the terror I had faced. I would occasionally read through its pages, not out of fear, but to remind myself of the strength it took to confront the unknown. The house was gone from my life, but its shadows would forever haunt my memories. As I reflect on my time in that cursed house, I realized that the true horror was not just the entity that resided in the basement, but the darkness that lurked within myself. The fear, the desperation, and the struggle to overcome the unknown had revealed aspects of my own nature that I had never confronted before. The house may have been sold and the altar dismantled, but the experiences I had will stay with me forever. I have learned to embrace the shadows, to understand that darkness is not just an external force, but something that can exist within us all. The house may be gone, but its lessons will remain a part of me, shaping my perception of the world and the mysteries that lie within.
Story 6.
Every evening, as the sun dips below the horizon and the shadows stretch long and thin, a chilling unease settles over our apartment building. We've all heard the stories, the whispered rumors about the basement. They say that those who venture down there never come back. It's become a sort of local legend, a dark mystery wrapped in a shroud of fear. Last night, however, I was unable to ignore the odd, rhythmic sound that began to emanate from the basement. At first, it was just a faint murmur, almost like the distant thumping of a drum. But as the night deepened, the noise grew louder, more insistent. Something inside me stirred, a blend of curiosity and dread. I had to find out what was making that sound. It was a decision I would soon regret. Armed with nothing but a flashlight and a trembling resolve, I approached the basement door. Its rusted hinges creaked in protest as I pushed it open, revealing a dark staircase descending into the abyss. My heart pounded as I took my first tentative step down, each creak of the old steps echoing ominously through the silence. The air grew colder as I descended, and an overpowering stench of decay filled my nostrils. My flashlight barely pierced the darkness, revealing nothing but shadows dancing on the walls. The rhythmic thumping grew louder, more intense, like a heartbeat resonating through the very walls of the building. As I reached the bottom, I noticed something strange. The floor was slick and uneven, as though something had been dragged across it. My flashlight beam flickered, catching glimpses of strange, indistinguishable shapes in the dim light. My gut twisted with a primal sense of danger, but the curiosity that drove me forward kept my feet moving. The thumping noise was now accompanied by a low, guttural growl, and my flashlight revealed something that defied comprehension, a mass of shifting, writhing forms, their grotesque shapes barely visible in the dim light. I realized with horror that I was looking at a colony of creatures, something beyond human understanding, and they were waiting. My heart raced as I watched in horrified fascination. The creatures, with their pallid, emaciated bodies and gaping maws, seemed to be in a constant state of frenzy. Their eyes glowed with a malevolent hunger, and I could see that they were feeding on something, or someone. The sight was both nauseating and mesmerizing, a grotesque ballet of predation and despair. Suddenly, a piercing scream erupted from the depths of the creature's lair. It was a sound of pure agony, one that seemed to echo through the very core of my being. The scream was cut short, and a sickening silence followed, broken only by the sounds of the creature's feasting. I knew then that the rumors were true. The basement was not just a place of mystery but a site of unspeakable horrors. Panic surged through me. I turned to flee, my steps quickening as I scrambled up the stairs. The thought of being discovered, of becoming just another meal for these creatures, spurred me to move faster. My flashlight bobbed wildly, casting erratic shadows on the walls as I raced back to the safety of the building's upper floors. I burst through the basement door and slammed it shut behind me, the loud bang resonating through the empty hallway. My breath came in ragged gasps, and my mind struggled to process what I had just witnessed. I leaned against the door, trying to steady my racing heart, but the images of the creature's ravenous eyes and the screams of their victims lingered, haunting my thoughts. In the days that followed, I tried to warn the other tenants, but they dismissed my story as a figment of a vivid imagination, perhaps brought on by the stress of living in such a dilapidated building. No one would believe me, and the basement remained off limits to all but those who had already made their peace with the possibility of never returning. The fear was palpable, an almost tangible force that kept us all away from the basement. I couldn't bring myself to go near it again, though the haunting sounds occasionally drifted up through the floors. Each time I heard them, I was reminded of the dark truth hidden below, a colony of horrors, ever hungry, waiting for their next victim. Time seemed to stretch and warp as I lived with the knowledge of what lay beneath our feet. I could no longer sleep soundly, each creak of the building becoming a harbinger of dread. My nights were plagued by nightmares of the basement, of those creatures reaching out with their ghastly limbs, dragging me into their hellish domain. I watched as the once vibrant community of our building began to crumble under the weight of fear. Tenants moved out, driven away by inexplicable anxieties and the unsettling atmosphere that had taken root. The building, once a place of life and activity, was now a shell of its former self. The basement door remained shut, a silent guardian of the horrors within. No one dared to challenge the legend, and the creatures continued their dark feast, hidden from the light of day. The building became a tomb of sorts, a place where the living were haunted by the shadows of what lay beneath. Every now and then, I would hear a new noise from the basement, a scraping, a low murmur, or a distant cry. Each sound was a reminder of the night I had ventured into the darkness, a constant and chilling reminder that the basement was far more than a mere storage space. It was a den of nightmares, and I was one of the few who knew its true nature. I attempted to tell my story to anyone who would listen, but my warnings fell on deaf ears. People looked at me with pity or skepticism, unable to comprehend the reality of the terror that lurked below. My warnings were dismissed as the ravings of a frightened mind, and the basement remained a place of mystery and fear. As time passed, I began to question my own sanity. Had I truly seen what I thought I had, or was it all a product of my overactive imagination? Yet, deep down, I knew the truth. The basement held a darkness that defied logic, a malevolent presence that thrived on fear and despair. One evening, I overheard a conversation in the hallway. A group of new tenants had moved in, young and adventurous, eager to explore every corner of their new home. My heart sank as I realized they were discussing the basement, their curiosity piqued by the stories and the air of mystery that surrounded it. I tried to intervene, to warn them of the dangers lurking below, but my pleas were met with dismissive laughter. They were determined to investigate, to uncover the secrets of the basement for themselves. It was a decision that would lead them down the same dark path I had once tread. That night, I lay awake in my bed, listening to the sounds of footsteps and laughter fading into the depths of the building. A part of me hoped that they would find nothing, that they would return unharmed. But another part, the part that knew the truth, feared the worst. As the hours passed, an eerie silence fell over the building. The usual creaks and groans of the old structure were absent, replaced by an oppressive stillness that seemed to hang in the air. I waited in dread, my mind racing with thoughts of what might be happening below. When the silence was finally broken by the sound of hurried footsteps and panicked cries, I knew that something terrible had occurred. I waited for them to return, to hear their stories and see their faces, but as the minutes turned into hours, I realized that they were never coming back. The basement door remained shut, the sounds from within now a haunting reminder of the fate that awaited those who ventured too close. The building was once again a place of fear and foreboding, and I was left with the knowledge that the horrors below had claimed new victims. In the days that followed, the building became even more desolate. The new tenants were never found, their disappearance adding to the growing legend of the basement. No one dared to investigate further, and the fear of the unknown kept us all away from the basement door. I spent my days in a state of constant anxiety, haunted by the memories of that night and the knowledge of the creatures that lurked below. My nights were filled with the echoes of screams and the soft, unsettling thump of the creature's hunger. Despite my attempts to move on, I knew that the basement held a dark and terrible truth. The creatures remained a constant presence in my mind, their insatiable hunger a reminder of the darkness that lurked just out of sight. The basement was a place of nightmares, a realm of horror that would forever remain hidden from the light of day. Now, as I look back on the events that transpired, I realize that there is no escaping the shadows that dwell beneath. The basement has become a symbol of the unknown, a place where fears and nightmares come to life. It is a reminder of the darkness that can exist just below the surface, waiting for the unsuspecting to stumble into its grasp. I live with the knowledge that the basement is still there, still home to the creatures that feast on fear and despair. And though I try to forget, the memory of that night remains a constant presence, a chilling reminder of the horrors that lie hidden in the darkness. I hope that anyone who reads this takes heed of the warnings. The basement is not a place for curiosity or bravery, it is a realm of unspeakable terror, and once you venture into its depths, there may be each creak of the building seem to remind me of the horrors below, a constant, creeping reminder of the unseen terrors that lurked just out of sight.